more important that, you're working with a surrogate that lives in a state where you're not going to run into legal problems.
Especially now.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you just want to make sure that, and we're here to kind of help with all of that, to make sure that they're not, choosing a surrogate in a state where they could run into legal issues.
Welcome to Donor Conception Conversations. This is the one podcast created exclusively for people who are planning to use donor conception to build their family or have donor-conceived children. I'm Lisa Schumann. I'm your host. As a researcher, a therapist, and an expert in donor conception, I'm passionate about helping people build their family. After decades of work in the field and working on site at some of the world's best fertility clinics through my center, the Center for Family Building, I've seen thousands of donors and recipients. I can share the tools and the truths that you need to have a better path to parenthood or to help tackle those tough parenting issues. If it's about donor conception, we're going to talk about it. So today, I'm honored to have Gail Sexton Anderson. She's dedicated her career to helping intended parents from all walks of life. She holds a master's degree in counseling from Harvard Graduate School. And after graduate school, she joined a research group in the psychology department of Yale University. Then she joined a group of researchers in pediatric neurology at Yale, doing developmental testing on children born prematurely with very low birth weight. So if that's not impressive enough, she's also started Donor Concierge and has worked with many, many programs and is able to now bring her calm and thoughtful disposition to her work. She's also started a group called Tulip, which she'll talk to you a little bit about. And in her life, she's been married since 1984 and has 2 wonderful children. And having the privilege of being a parent has also shed light for her on how important it is to help others bring their families into the world. So with that, I'm going to let Gail introduce a little bit about her group, Donor Concierge, and Tulip's group as well, and a little bit about her and her perspective and what she sees happening in the world of donor conception. So welcome, Gail. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. So a little bit about me, as Lisa's already shared sort of what my background is. And I think being a parent has given me a real heart for helping people to, create their families. And what I found, I've worked in this field for almost, getting close to 30 years now. It's a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found when I first got into this field and I was working within an agency, I found that it was really hard for intended parents to, when they can't have a family using their own genetics, to kind of let go and be able to find someone that they could be comfortable with. So what started out as me trying to help them find someone, through looking through the donors that, we had in whatever agency I was working with and sharing with them, possible candidates. If they couldn't find someone at a certain point, I'd say, well, these are some other agencies that I think are, reputable. And why don't you take a look at the donors that they have? Often people would come back to me and they would say, I finally found a donor. I really appreciated talking to you. And, the donor was probably not, may not have been from the agency I was with. But what I got satisfaction from was helping them to find someone, because I didn't like the idea of choose who we have, or you apparently don't really want to be a parent. And sometimes that would be the feeling that the intended parents would get, even going to the clinic if they have their own database, was here we have these donors and, you can wait 2 years to work with this donor. It was just something that it was very, very difficult for intended parents, and they might get discouraged and just, walk away. That's how Donor Concierge got started. First, it was 3 agencies that I was working with, and it was 10. And then, now we work with, probably close to 100 different agencies just for egg donation. And, there are about 200 agencies out there for surrogacy, and we work with probably 75 of those.
Wow.
And we help people find sperm donors as well.
Great.
So we are not an agency ourselves. Some people have described us as an agency of agencies. What we do is really act as an advocate and liaison for intended parents to help them move through the process, first by finding possible candidates. We have our own proprietary database. We are the only ones that have this, where all of the donors that, from agencies that we work with are updated every day in this database with, of course, permission from the agencies. So the first week of the process is helping them to, narrow it down to, who are the ones that they're most interested in. And then the follow-up work to help them make sure that these candidates, meet the requirements of their clinic and can travel to their clinic and all of that sort of thing. We describe the difference between Donor Concierge and Tulip somewhat with if you are the type of person who is going to, like if you're renovating your house, and you're the type of person that wants to go to Home Depot and do this yourself, Tulip is for you, where you can go on Tulip. There's, a monthly fee, very minimal monthly fee, where you can, look and see who's out there. Though if you are the type of person that hires a general contractor, because we have done this thousands of times, and for any intended parent going into this, it's new and there are so many ins and outs that you may not be aware of, and we can help you through that process. So that's kind of the difference between the 2.
Mm-hmm. So what do you see that intended parents are usually interested in when they come to see you?
Usually they're interested in finding someone who kind of looks like they could fit into their family. Often they're looking for someone who, looks like the intended mother, or, when it comes to same-sex couples, two men, maybe looking for someone who, looks like them or their mother or, their sister. So they're looking for someone who looks like they could fit into their family. And they also want other characteristics quite often. But it all kind of comes down to finding someone that they can relate to who kind of fits into their family. They may be looking for someone who is a certain height, certain, ethnic background. They may be looking for someone who has, certain educational qualities that, or certain likes and interests, because those are things that are important to them. They may be like, one thing could be something like, we love dogs. We need to make sure that she's doesn't have any allergies to dogs,
right.
Because we don't want our child to not be able to be, around
right.
dogs. So there are a lot of things. Though the most important things, of course, are that, the young woman is healthy, has good fertility, is able to travel to your clinic. Those are kind of the real key things, that because you could choose someone and she may seem perfect, but if she doesn't have good fertility or can't travel to your clinic, then I always say fall in like, do not fall in love, and choose at least 3 to 5 possible candidates, because there are things that will come up that may eliminate someone. And if you kind of put all your hope in one particular individual and something doesn't work out, it can be really devastating.
Well, I'm glad you raised that, Gail, because this is, something that I'm always clamoring about, which is, the initial impetus for choosing someone may not be the right way to kind of look at the picture, right? We may want to find a person that we fall in love with, somebody who feels right to us. I mean, I've heard so many recipients say, she's the one, and that's lovely. But as many people know, we're not just getting her, right? We're getting her whole genetic pool. We're getting her health history, and young people are healthy, but what about her family, her grandparents, and how complementary is it with the intended parents? And so how do you manage that in explaining, because you need to counsel all of these intended parents about all the things that maybe they're not thinking about?
And you mentioned some really good points. Some of the things that can wind up being something that they might eliminate someone who really could be a really good possibility are certain factors that they sometimes forget, that say their husband or the sperm provider, whatever the situation may be, they're half of the equation. They need to also remember that they are not going to be giving birth to a clone of the donor.
Right.
They're getting genetics. Those genetics then mixed in with the sperm provider's genetics are creating a whole new person. And just like you may look a lot like your sister or your mother or whatever, you're not an exact clone of either. You're a very different individual. And, just because a young woman may have, a nose piercing or a tattoo or something that you're like, I don't like that. Or maybe she is bright but didn't go to a top 20 school. Your husband is, half of this equation. And the young woman is, a bright, lovely person. Just keep that in mind, that Nobel Prize winners do not beget Nobel Prize winners.
So, exactly.
There are a lot of things to think about. It's a complicated little equation. Nothing's going to be perfect. So kind of keep those things in mind. And we can't control everything. And it's really nice to be able to feel like this feels right. And it's, there's this little something shining in the young woman's eyes that makes you feel like she's the right one. But there are those other factors of making sure that, she has really good health and has good fertility, which can be checked. So,
Yes, and a lot of people aren't aware of that. So thank you for raising that.
yeah.
And what about with Tulip? Does Tulip offer like counseling services also, or is that really with Donor Concierge?
Tulip doesn't offer counseling services. They do have sort of a coach that they are interacting with, which is mostly it's an online process because it's more like they decide who they're interested in. They can ask a few questions, through the coach, and then we introduce them to the agency that is representing the donor, and the agency will take it from that point on.
And I would imagine in both cases, you're also helping them understand all the other details, like psychological screening is really important, and making sure that the woman has a good complementary idea about disclosure issues and all of those things.
Absolutely. One thing that I'd say is new or newer from, like, say, when I started in this field many, many years ago. At that time, it was considered like no one ever needs to know. Though I'd say that even then, we're in California. California tended to be much more sort of progressive in
Open.
terms of feeling like psychologically it's much better that it's a very transparent process. Doesn't mean you're going to have your donor come to Thanksgiving dinner, but it's sort of like having an avenue for your child to eventually be able to, have more information about that donor. And there's something called Identity 18, or at least that's the shorthand for it, that can be put into the contract. You can check with the donor to make sure she's open to this idea. Because when you're going through this process, the issue is your issue. This is something that, that in order to create your family, this is the avenue that is important for you to take. But once you have your child, then it's the whole family, and it is information that this is affecting the child, and sort of who it's information they need to have because it's important. It's about them, and of course, the whole family is involved with this. So that's something that I think more and more people are wanting to make sure that the donor would be open to the possibility of maybe some future contact.
And do you find that more of your clients rather than fewer of them are interested in that now?
Oh yes, definitely. And because it's sort of we were talking a little bit before we got on air that there's the myth of anonymity, because certainly when you're going through, looking at profiles, you don't really know, you don't have her last name. You may not even have her real name. It may just be a number, but, she is a real person out there. And with the, like say 23andMe or a variety of other, methods, people are able to find that, they were donor conceived. So it's much better, that you preempt that. It's sort of like making it part of your child's story from the very beginning. And I often recommend that people do, like when they're pregnant, that they sort of talk about this. And it's not because I think the child can, take all this in. It's really a chance for you as the parent to get comfortable with sharing the story with your child. And if it's always part of the, their story, and when I say this, like you could put together, I used to say a scrapbook. Now they have much more sophisticated books that you could put together.
Yes, we have one.
Pictures. That's right. You do,
Yes.
which is great. Because, it's something where kids love stories about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So you create this book, and then it's something that, you can, even when they're very little, you can go through this. And so it's just part of their life. It's not a big secret. In fact, I know some people who have children who are like in their teens, and the kids are kind of like, yeah, mom, I know.
Right. Right.
And it's like, it's not like they, they don't care.
Right.
It's like, you're their mother, or you're their father.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So that's so interesting, and that's good to know that there are more and more people who are interested in having open relationships with their donors. What about if we start to look at the other side? I know we're talking about the intended parents and how they're feeling and what their experience is like. What about the donors? What's your experience with your donors and how they're now perceiving their donations? Are those views changing?
I'm not sure if they're changing, or we're much more aware of how the donor sees their donation. Because I think it's always been a situation, and I can say this with confidence just because in California, I used to work with a program who would have interviews, like the couple would get to meet a couple of donors. We'd limit it to just two, but that way they'd kind of get a chance to meet face to face and get a
Wow.
sense of, does this feel like a good fit? And so they were always lovely meetings. They didn't have the last names, but that sort of thing. But I think that people who choose to be donors are very much aware that, this is not their child. They're not doing it to have children.
Mm-hmm.
Every once in a while, you'll find a young woman who says, "Oh, I don't think I want to have kids, but I'd love to be able to help someone else."
Mm-hmm.
And their perspective may change as they get a little bit older and meet the right person. Who knows? But I found that donors are often quite open to the idea of a future connection, and I've had people who have come back to me to say, "Hey, do you think you could help me find my donor? My child is now 18 years old or whatever." And, they're asking questions and they want to know if they could possibly have a conversation with the donor. And so I've been able to help them find the donor through
Wow.
social media usually. And when I contact the donors, all except one, have been very open to the idea of like, "Oh, I'd be happy to talk to them. Give them my phone number, give them my email address." And, with their permission from both sides, if they're comfortable, I'll make, an introduction, usually just an email introduction. And then they can decide from there, whether they want to, meet up or whatever. But I found that they've been, just very thoughtful and open. And it's not the big, scary thing that doctors in the past would be like, no one needs to know. And we have to protect their privacy, because I think you need to make sure that they're comfortable with it. But it's not the big issue that has been made out to be.
Yeah, I think that's so good for everyone to hear that there's, there may be a lot of fear and anxiety around that. And there's a lot of steps along the way, right? And you probably see a number of contracts and agreements, right? Where people maybe want to meet, or maybe they just want to speak, or maybe they want to share medical information, or maybe they want to have a relationship. It doesn't have to be that this person is now going to move into your house with you. It could be
Right.
a number of experiences, and everyone can kind of collaborate. And I think that's what's so nice about being able to be in a situation where you can put these people together and then they can decide, what kind of relationship do we want to have? It must feel very empowering for them.
And interestingly enough, sometimes the kids are kind of like, because I've also heard stories from, clients that the kids are kind of like, "Will you come with me?" Like it's like their parent is the person who's raised them. So it's not
Right.
like they're like, "Bye, I'm off to, create a new life with
Yes.
my donor."
Right.
It's more like, "Here's a stranger I'm going to be meeting, your mom or dad."
Yeah, and it's a very unusual experience, right? I mean, it's a very unusual experience, but it doesn't have to be a scary one or something that's intimidating in any way. From the donor's perspective, what do you see as their feelings when they first come in? Of course, they're young, and they have to kind of grapple with these new concepts that they're not going to be anonymous, and that they could have this relationship, and that they need to put together a legal contract. And those are very mature ideas.
Mhm.
And you're thinking far
Right.
ahead. And, I am the parent of two just post teens. I can say that, sometimes you're not that mature in your early 20s, and it's hard to kind of think ahead. How do you kind of manage that and really helping them understand what they're getting into, and what their options are and all of that?
And just to clarify, because I don't have direct contact with donors now because they are working with the agencies, but the agencies do the same thing that I will talk about when I was involved in an agency, which is making sure that the donors understand, kind of what they're signing up for, not just the medical aspect of things, but to think through things like, when I used to interview donors, some of the questions I would ask them would be, if you have had any kind of, like, say, sexual abuse in your past, this may feel very uncomfortable for you. It may not be something that you want to do. Would you be open to the possibility of, meeting the parents at some point, or meeting the child at some point?
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you would be open to? Just because you want to make sure that they have thought through these things. One of the questions I would often ask would be like, if you're challenged by, say, your parents or any of your friends, of like, "Oh, how could you do that? Why are you doing that?" Would you still feel strongly about doing it? Or would that kind of make you say, "Oh, no, I don't think I can do that because it doesn't feel like I'd be accepted"? or that,
Mm-hmm.
that they would be objecting and I can't be comfortable with making that decision. So those are just things that you want to make sure that they really have thought through those. And what I find is that most donors, obviously they are compensated, and that is, not a small thing. But usually they go into this with the idea of I think they're attracted initially by that, oh, great, I can pay off some student loans. But I think that to go through all of this, they also have to have sort of an altruistic perspective as well,
Mm-hmm.
that they
Mm-hmm.
want to be able to help someone to create a family. I've talked to a lot of young women who, either had a relative or a nanny or whatever, people who had some fertility issues. And it just made them really think about it. Sometimes they've offered to be a donor for someone. And, maybe it was their cousin, and their cousin said, that might be a little too close for comfort to be sitting around the Thanksgiving table after we had my child.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just given them the impetus to want to help someone else. And so then they decide that they'd like to apply to be a donor.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think that's good for people to know. As you, I think, know, Gail, I started an open donor program at a clinic, a fertility clinic, and I found that donors very often went in with this, as you said, altruistic idea about wanting to help someone. And then that only grew when they were open. I found very often they would say, I met the intended parents and I really felt like I was going through this medical
Yeah,
procedure and it was just going to be 2 weeks of medication, a little medical procedure, and it was going to be over. And now I can see the faces of these people who I'm contributing to, and it's changing their lives. And it really
yeah,
gives so much more meaning to me. So I really feel that it's so helpful for donors to have that encouragement, to be able to be open, to be able to have those experiences, because it may actually make their donation process even better.
I agree, because I've worked with donors who maybe they did not get to, meet or learn anything about the intended parents
Mm-hmm.
in, say, their first donation. And then maybe they have that opportunity in the next donation. They say, wow, it really made a big difference to me because I was rooting for them, that everything would work out well. And that's also why I think it's important there are some, clinics that are very, closed about letting the donor know kind of what the outcome was for the privacy of the intended parents. But I think there's closure that the donor gets, and they
Mm-hmm.
feel a lot of joy for the
Yes,
couple when they know that, everything worked out well and that there was a positive pregnancy. So it's something that I think can make a big difference to them.
I agree. And with regard to that, do you think that the donors are also thinking about kind of the longer term implications? You started to talk a little bit about their family. This is going to move towards more openness, is going to have wider implications for lots of people because, of course, now you have the grandmother who always wanted a grandchild, and maybe the donor doesn't want to have children of her own, and maybe the grandmother's interested, and so the intended parents have to agree to that. Or maybe they're going to get married to somebody later and that person's going to have an issue with it. I mean, they have to start to think about all of these things and how it's going to impact their life and their relationships.
No, I think that's very true. When I'm working with, a gay male couple who sometimes they're like, oh, well, she'll be the mother. It's like, no, you are creating a family where you have two dads. You don't want your child to
Yes,
be thinking in terms of like there's something missing. There's nothing missing. Your family's complete
right.
just as it is.
Yes, yes.
So, and I wrote a blog on that, working with many of my gay friends who are in our field, who have created families, and to sort of like, how did they handle this sort of thing? So I think in the same way, I think that, the donor may need to educate her family that, yes, I'm choosing to do this, but this is, it's a very clear delineation. If it's something where their parents see it as like, this is their grandchild out there, they may want to rethink whether they want to be a donor, because
Mm-hmm.
that's, not a healthy perspective.
I agree with you, but I also think it has to do with the match. I
Sure.
have, right, just like you see surrogacy matches, people have to be able to agree on things. And I've seen open donor relationships where the family does want to have a relationship with the donor's family, and then other
Hmm.
ones where they don't. And so it
Sure.
as I think as our field, continues to evolve, the donor will have more say in who she's matched with too. Now, right now, it's, almost kind of all one-sided, right? We have the intended parents really looking for the right match of the donor, but the donor also, may want a family who wants to be open because maybe they want to say to their grandmother, this is not a relationship where we're going to have Thanksgiving dinners together. This is a relationship where I'm going to share medical information. That's it, because that way they can really decide themselves what they want.
And I agree with you. But as you said, it has to be something where everyone is in agreement, because you don't want a situation, because that could be very frightening for intended parents.
Yes.
If their idea is like, I want a donor, I don't want to be involved in her life or her and ours. And it goes the other way, where donors may be like, nope. I've had donors who they have big plans for what they want to do in their life, and they don't want someone coming and saying like, oh, by the way, you're responsible for me in some way.
Oh, yeah.
She is not. So
yes, exactly. Yeah. I've seen donors who say, I want to travel the world. I'm happy to be in touch with medical information, but I really want to go and travel and live in Peru or live in, Cambodia or wherever. And I want to have this separate life, and I don't want to have that involvement. So it's very interesting to see how all of these things are evolving and how the donor's opinion is really going to impact, just like we see now, I think, in surrogacy, right? The surrogate and the intended parents really have to be on the same page about so many things in order to be matched.
Absolutely. Which, of course, that is a much more interactive relationship, because usually when it's a surrogacy situation, the intended parents are in regular contact with their surrogate, and they have, a match meeting to kind of get a sense of, is this a good fit? Am I comfortable, with the other party? So it is a much more equal process, because the surrogate can meet the family and decide, am I comfortable with these people? Would this be a good thing for me? Because just as, the intended parents have the dream of, having their family, the surrogate has her dream of her journey as a surrogate, and the kind of relationship she wants, and the kind of people that she'd feel really comfortable helping with this amazing thing that she's willing to do for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, for everyone out there, Gail's groups also work in surrogacy, right? You match,
Yes.
You find surrogates for people as well. And do you find that that's changing at all, the field of surrogacy?
It has for us. And the field of surrogacy, yes, it is changing in that actually COVID had a huge impact on surrogacy, in that there were a lot of young women who did not want to be vaccinated for whatever reason. And intended parents often were not comfortable going forward with a surrogate who was not vaccinated, which I'm all for, that she needs to be vaccinated. But it is something that created sort of a problem in terms of like, there's not enough surrogates. And so the waiting times have gotten a bit longer. Something that we do at Donor Concierge, because we work with so many different surrogacy programs, is I learned a long time ago that just seeing a profile is not enough to know whether that surrogate is really going to be a good candidate. Now we review the medical records. We have someone who has been doing this for a very long time and used to review medical records for surrogates for a well-known clinic. And now she works for us. If a profile looks good for a surrogate, we then review the medical. We don't have set up the meeting until we have a sense that this surrogate is likely to pass the clinic that the couple is working with, because we also are working with the clinic to find out is there anything beyond sort of the usual ASRM guidelines that are important to you that you want to see in a surrogate profile. And so we're looking at it, from that perspective. So we only approve probably out of, like maybe 10% of the, candidates that are shared with us, because many of them, for one reason or another, are not going to pass that clinic's criteria. So we're not sharing them with our clients until we know that this is a candidate that is most likely going to be approved by the clinic. And then we will make that introduction, because we don't want, once they have that sort of meet and greet, there's the, kind of the bond that starts of feeling like, oh, she's great. And then if something comes up, it can be devastating to find out, that she just doesn't qualify. So it's something where we're taking those steps. And because we work with so many different agencies, we're able to usually match our clients in a more efficient way because we're sort of aggregating, the possibilities, reviewing these, and then saying, here's a candidate. And we're also taking into consideration what, of course, the intended parents are hoping to find, in a surrogate. A lot of what we also do is just educate the intended parents because there are times when, someone might say, oh, I want a surrogate who lives only an hour away from the clinic. I want, and they have a whole list of things.
Right.
If they have a very long list of their must-haves, they may not be able to find someone that's going to be a fit. So we will talk to them about the possibility of many surrogates, most surrogates will fly and travel to go to your clinic. So they don't have to be in your backyard. And probably you're not going to find someone in your backyard because there are so many different things that are going to be more important than location.
Mm-hmm.
It's more important that you're working with a surrogate that lives in a state where you're not going to run into legal problems. And
Especially
we help
now.
our intended parents be aware of it. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So you just want to make sure that, and we're here to kind of help with all of that, to make sure that they're not, choosing a surrogate in a state where they could run into legal issues.
Yeah, there's so much to think about. And I could talk to you all day, Gail, but we do have to wrap up now. So, and it's been so nice to have you here. Gail and I have known each other for a lot of years, and it's so nice to see the whole field evolve in such a positive way. And for us both to be able to be on this journey together, it's really wonderful. So I appreciate you sharing with us everything that you've shared today, and your insight and knowledge is really valuable. So anyone who wants to ask Gail questions, please feel free to reach out to her. Where can people reach you?
They can reach me at gail@donorconcierge.com. That's my email.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Gail. You can feel free to reach out to me at familybuilding.net. And certainly, please subscribe because that's how you can make sure that you don't miss any of these episodes. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Like, you really need to act quick when you find an egg donor that you think could be a match.
Yes.
Because there were some cases where we took too long to decide, and the egg donor either decided she didn't want to do it anymore or did it with somebody else and things like that. So
Happened twice.
Happened twice, yeah.
Wow.